Hey, what is up guys, Mergaman4 here, and just in time for Halloween, we have a Doctor Who episode that's full of scary, giant spiders with arachnids in the UK. So, Arachnids in the UK is the 4th episode of Series 11. We're finally starting to get into a good flow of things, and believe it or not, next week is actually halfway through the series, so we're getting pretty deep into the series by this point. It's going by quick, and that in part is because we have 2 less episodes than we used to have, but here is actually when everything has finally come into place for all the introductory stuff. I thought that happened last week, but it turns out that technically Graham, Ryan, and Yasmin weren't actually companions yet. This is actually the episode where they officially become companions, and I didn't realize that they weren't yet. I just kind of assumed that they would be, but no, here we are almost halfway through the series and they finally become actual official companions. And this episode returns us to present-day Sheffield, and actually, as many others have pointed out online, a much better and more accurate title would probably have been Spiders in Sheffield, because not only does everything only take place in Sheffield, but it's also just spiders, no other kinds of arachnids. I've heard that the title is a play on the song Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols, but to be honest, I don't really know what the point of that would be. I mean, I'm not familiar with the lyrics, but I really don't see how parodying that title, like what it has to do with the episode. So Spiders in Sheffield probably would have been a little bit better. And I do remember, now I've gotten used to the title, it's not as bad, but when it was first announced, I'm like, that's a really awkward sounding title. But anyway, that's just the title, doesn't really matter about the episode itself. So the episode starts out with some pretty clever opening shots actually that are at ground level, that would be from the spider's perspective, and we see a bunch of the locations that we eventually visit in the episode. It's a good way to throw us into the episode and set the right kind of tone and mood. And pretty much right off the bat, after those opening shots, we're introduced to this character of Jack Robertson. So he's kind of like a main antagonist. It's a bit more complicated than that. He's not working against the Doctor and her companions, but he's kind of trying to solve things his own way, which does rub against the way that the Doctor would usually solve issues. But I'll talk about that a bit later. We're introduced to his character right off the bat, and he's very much a caricature. It's obvious that he's kind of like a parody of Trump. He's a businessman, doesn't really seem to care about anyone else, is just interested in his own affairs, and very overtly American, which we'll get into a little bit later as well. But yeah, the scene opens with him, and another thing this episode introduces is Yaz's family, who we haven't seen anything of so far. Yaz's mum is working for this businessman, so he's opening a new hotel in Sheffield, and she's going to be the general manager, but she came to work when she wasn't supposed to, so he fires her, and he's just very, very clearly supposed to be that huge dick of a character that you're not supposed to like at all. But yeah, like I mentioned, we're introduced to Yaz's family here as well. So Yaz's mom gets the most screen time, and she's pretty heavily involved in the plot. Yaz's sister and dad we see briefly, but we don't get to know them a whole bunch. And I feel like we're probably going to return to her family later this season, but they honestly don't leave too much of an impact. I guess they do a decent job of helping to flesh Yaz out a little bit more, but in all honesty, they didn't really affect me at all throughout the story. And oh, before I forget, one thing I want to mention, we're introduced to the TARDIS team this episode through a brand new time vortex design. Something I was disappointed with in Capaldi's era was that we never really saw the TARDIS flying through his version of the time vortex. The only time we saw it was in Twice Upon a Time, and that time vortex wasn't based upon the opening title sequence, which was a little bit disappointing. Here we get a brand new time vortex, and I'm of two minds about it. On the one hand, I think it's a really interesting design, and I love the idea of different tunnels branching off to different times and places. That's really neat. But maybe it was just the way it was shot, but it seemed a little bit too chaotic and crazy for my liking. I don't know, I just didn't like the feeling of the camera was shaking all over the place, and I prefer a much more, I guess, smooth way of traveling, kind of like we saw in the Russell T Davies era with that vortex, and if I'm honest, I don't think anything can ever beat that time vortex. But anyway, yeah, it's a cool new design, and we get a really neat shot of the camera transitioning from the exterior of the TARDIS and the time vortex to the interior. That's really neat. But anyway, the Doctor and her, well, not yet companions, have arrived back in Sheffield, and it seems like they're going to part ways, which is a little bit weird, because it's very clear that both the Doctor and her friends, you know, they want to still be traveling with each other, so I'm not sure why the Doctor doesn't invite them. But I guess we get a little sense of that later on in the episode. But then Yaz invites her to her house for tea, and so she goes and visits. And actually, what I love about this scene is the Doctor's social awkwardness here. It's really entertaining to watch, and it's fun to be able to see Jodie Whittaker dealing with this side of the Doctor, because up until this point we haven't really seen her in a domestic setting. Because in the first episode, when she was on present-day Earth, she was still kind of a little bit crazy from the post-regeneration trauma. But in the last two episodes, obviously we haven't been on present-day Earth, so we don't really get that same kind of tone. And it's fun to see her trying to make small talk and not knowing if she's doing it very well or not. It's just a really fun scene, and Jodie Whittaker did a really good job with it. Graham, meanwhile, he's gone back to his own house. He's just reminiscing and trying to cope with the passing of Grace, because I guess he wouldn't have been in his house very much since Grace passed away. And so he's trying to cope with it, and we get a couple of touching scenes in the episode where he's kind of got her voice in his head. We see her in the background. I thought it was really clever. The first time we see her, she's blurred out in the background because, of course, she's not really there, just in Graham's head. And it's really compelling to see Graham struggle with his grief as the series has gone on. This is the time where it's impacting him the most, I think, because he's back home, and it plays a very vital role later in the episode to him becoming a companion. So that's very interesting to explore. While this is going on, though, we're starting to get our first hints at the spider activity that's been going on. One thing I want to note is that it's got a very slow build-up. I felt like it took a while to get to the spiders, and actually I think it took somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes before we actually saw our first spider of the episode, which surprised me a little bit. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but I do think they maybe could have sped that up a little bit and gotten to the point a tiny bit quicker, but I understand what they were going for, and I do think it's good for them to continue trying to flesh out our companions a little bit more, because I still get the feeling that 3 companions might be a little bit too much. I know that it's been done in the past, particularly in the 60s, but Yaz, despite this being almost halfway through the series, and Yaz has been better served, she still doesn't feel, I guess, necessary. You could remove her and it wouldn't really impact a lot. Graham and Ryan are the main companions, and actually, now that I think of it, I feel like this episode serviced all of the companions. I guess I don't want to say worst, because they were all good in it, but overall I guess they had the least impact for me in this episode. And I can't really think of any standout moments from the episodes with the companions except for maybe the very ending. But I don't know, I as of this point in time, I'm still feeling like maybe it should have only been 2 companions with Graham and Ryan. I'm not really seeing the justification for Yaz's inclusion yet, but hopefully we can get that soon. I know episode 6 coming up is going to focus a bit more on her and actually be delving into her family's history a little bit, so hopefully we can get some more from her pretty soon. But anyway, we are introduced to the spider problem by one of Yaz's family's neighbors. They had a package for the Khan family to pick up, but every time they've gone over there, she hasn't answered the door, and we have this other woman who's seeming to try to want to contact her, but she can't get to her either, and so they all go into the apartment together and find it covered in spider webs everywhere. And apparently she's only been gone a couple of days, so obviously this isn't a natural occurrence. They go into her bedroom, find her all wrapped up in spider webs, and realize that what if the spider is still here? And now we get our spider reveal. And I have to say, these spiders look quite good. There are moments of dodgy CGI. They're not perfect, but I think I can pretty confidently say these are the best spiders that have ever appeared in Doctor Who. It's not the first time we've had spiders as a major element. The earliest one I can think of was Planet of the Spiders in 1974, John Pertwee's last story as the Doctor. I liked the story quite a bit, but the spiders admittedly weren't great. So it's pretty awesome to see how far we've come. We've also got a sort of a spider thing in the Arachnids, half spider, half humanoid. And we also had the spider germs in Kill the Moon a few years ago, which didn't look too great in my opinion. They were pretty obviously CGI, but these ones look really, really good. It's just, they just look really realistic. They've got all the hairs on their legs and everything, and it's a really creepy design. The way that they move, out in the hallway after they run away from the giant spider, you see it descending from the ceiling on a web, and I'm sure, I don't have arachnophobia, but I'm sure a lot of people who are scared of spiders would just freak out from that. And yeah, I'd say in its portrayal of the spiders, it does a really good job. Another interesting thing about these spiders, actually, is that they're not any sort of like aliens at all. It's entirely Earth-based, which I think is the first time that's ever happened with spiders in Doctor Who, because the 8 legs in Planet of the Spiders, they were Earth spiders, but they've been transported accidentally to the planet of Metebelis 3 when a human colony ship went there, and they gradually mutated to become bigger, and they became more intelligent, and there was that. The Arachnids obviously is an alien creature, and the spider germs in Kill the Moon were native to the moon. So this is the first time, I think, that we've actually had Earth spiders without any sort of alien interference be the monster of the episode. But even this big spider, we do get to see bigger later. But this one, I think, he's probably about the size of your average human torso, like from like the main body size of it. So it's pretty sizable. I mean, I'm not usually scared of spiders, but I'd be pretty terrified if I saw a spider that big. It's at this point, I mentioned earlier that Yaz's mom had gotten fired, and so she called Yaz to go and pick her up, and so she goes to the hotel. But the hotel, as it turns out, is actually a base of sorts for the spiders. This is where we start to see a bit more of Jack Robertson. He comes out and says that they're trespassing, holds them at gunpoint to leave, but she mentions that she just wanted to check up in the rooms and make sure everything was okay because they're just about to open. And he says, well, they look terrible. Like, how could you let this terrible job happen? Yaz's mom is, of course, confused, and they go in. We see spider webs everywhere, so, uh-oh, giant spiders nearby. Jack Robertson has a scheduled bathroom break, and so he goes off briefly, and we get a really neat moment where Yaz hears a noise and sticks her head to the wall, and we pan to the other side of the wall and we see a giant spider on the other end. And then, while Jack Robertson's on his bathroom break, he hears a noise coming from the bathtub. And then out pops an even bigger spider. This one is massive. It's probably about the size of full-size human, like its body. And so, of course, he starts freaking out. That clip was in the Next Time trailer, and I assumed that would be his death scene. But he actually survives throughout the whole episode. He doesn't die. His bodyguard comes in. He traps the bodyguard in there. He hears a couple gunshots, peeks in, and sees the spider wrapping up his bodyguard in webbing and pulling the bodyguard down back into where it was hiding. And that's another pretty tense scene that was well executed and Oh, it's a pretty freaky scene. It's at this point that the doctor and everyone else arrives on the scene because they've determined, somehow, I'm actually not sure how this worked, but they determined that the giant spiders, it all revolved around this hotel. And so they arrive on the scene, and it's at this point that Jack Robertson joins forces with them, but he's got his kind of abrasive mindset towards it. And here's the thing, I mentioned earlier that he was a bit of a caricature. I did find his character to be very enjoyable to watch. He says a couple of pretty cheesy but funny lines. The actor, I can't remember his name, he gives a pretty hammy, over-the-top performance, but I think it's kind of to its benefit. I know some people didn't like it, but I thought it worked. I don't think his character works as a parody of Trump. That just feels kind of awkward, but as the over-the-top, selfish businessman, he's just a fun character, and I enjoy watching him when he's on screen. But one of the things I mentioned earlier as well, he's very obviously American in that his main solution is to shoot everything. And he says a line where I think it goes a bit too overt. Come on, this is what he says.
What's wrong with you people? What is wrong with this country? Why don't you do what normal people do? Get a gun, shoot things like a civilized person.
Like, that's just too far into caricature land. It just takes you right out of it, because no real person would actually say something like that. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I know there are some crazy people out there, but that was just a little too ridiculous and just pulled me right out of it. But anyway, they determine that they need to capture a spider to study it. Actually, something I forgot to mention, the person who was looking for the other person in the apartment, she's actually a scientist who had worked on the spiders, and so is that other person in the apartment. So there is a connection there. That's somewhat important. But anyway, so yeah, she's a scientist who works with, like, experimenting with spiders. But it is vital to note that these spiders are not a direct result of their experimentation. They're just trying to experiment to make spiders live longer and have, like, stronger silk and stuff like that. They didn't cause this. We find out what actually caused it later down the line. But they have a scientist with them, and she thinks that if they can get a spider specimen, that they can try and figure out what's going on and how to stop it. So they do, and actually, this is a really great scene. We see a spider going down the hallway towards Graham, and then at the last second, Ryan jumps out with a pot and clangs it over the spider. And then this swarm of spiders comes down from the other end of the hallway, and that's just really chilling and spine-tingling, even for someone like me who's not actively afraid of spiders. And I never had an issue with this episode. None of it was too much for me. I know a lot of people, apparently had to look away, even when they weren't afraid of spiders. Not me, but I could totally understand how this scene could be absolutely terrifying for some people. It was just well executed, and all those legs, and it is quite creepy. But here's the thing, though. They get that spider, but we never return to it. I thought maybe upon my first watch that I had missed something, but I watched it again a second time, and no, that never goes anywhere. It's really just an excuse for us to see more spiders and later see a much more important spider. But now we're getting close to the big reveal of why the spiders are so big. It turns out that these hotels are built on repurposed sites, in this one's case on top of an old coal mine, and so they go down to where the coal mine used to be to try to find out what's going on. They find a couple of people, including Robertson's old bodyguard, cocooned up, and they discover that they had been dumping landfill in these coal mines. Robertson had hired a company to dispose of the landfill, and they didn't really bother with any sort of health and safety regulations. They just kind of chucked it into the landfill, and it's just building up. And that same company was also what disposed of the waste from the scientist's lab, including the dead spider carcasses. So it turns out what happened was one of the spider carcasses wasn't actually dead. And there was a thing that they said a couple of times throughout the episode, that spiders keep growing as long as they're living. That isn't actually true, which when I heard that, I'm like, that doesn't sound realistic at all. And I looked it up, and it's not true. Apparently, So they grow until they have an adult stage. And I read about an article about this episode that if the adult stage was extended, then yes, they could keep growing. I guess what happened was the toxic waste just kind of fueled its growth because there was a bunch of food from the waste down there, so we could keep eating, and it just ended up growing and growing and growing. So good old toxic waste made it happen. I'm not really too bothered by that. It is a little bit of a flimsy argument, but it's Doctor Who. That's fine. I'm not really going to take it too seriously. It's good enough. So yeah, that's what caused the gigantic spiders. Oh, and I do want to mention that to get down there, they had to go through this locked security door with, it has all sort of caution, danger, potential of death signs, and I love a line the Doctor says here.
Look at this. Keep out, danger of death. You are not authorized to go in here.
Dude, I have all the authorization I ever need.
And I actually love that line. That's so Doctor. That's great. But anyway, meanwhile, while that's all happening, Graham and Ryan have been trying to find another spider because the scientists asked for a bigger spider, which in turn is pretty pointless because it never ends up going anywhere anyway. But anyway, they're in the ballroom of the hotel. They're walking along and kind of talking with each other. It's a little moment of bonding between them, and as Ryan's dad had left a note at Graham's house after Grace's death, trying to welcome Ryan to come back to his proper family. And there's a little bit of a touching moment where Ryan says, "I don't like that he used the word proper there." I guess because he's starting to feel a bit more like Graham is his family, I guess, which is great to see that kind of development. But then they realize neither of them checked the roof. They turn around. There's a big spider up there. Big spider. I think Graham describes it as the size of a small van. It's crazy big, and there's a brief but tense scene as it's chasing them along. We actually saw that bit in the trailer for the series, and they're able to keep it in the ballroom. They subsequently run into everyone else, tell them about the giant spider. They in turn tell them about how the spiders came about, and they begin to try to formulate a plan to stop the spiders and prevent them from harming anybody else. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, Robertson's idea is to just shoot them all and kill them all, which of course the Doctor doesn't like. And normally I would agree with her, but this is my major issue with the episode. For the most part, I generally quite enjoyed it. This resolution here really bugs me though, because he says we should just shoot them, right? Quick death. And the Doctor's response is we should let them die with dignity, which is fair, right? They're each living, breathing creatures. But she decides that the better solution is to lock them in Robertson's safe room and let them starve to death. What? Excuse me? Oh man, I thought I misheard or something, and then the second watch through I was like, no, I definitely didn't mishear. How is letting them starve to death a more humane way of killing them than shooting them? I understand Robertson's motivations are not humane. He doesn't care about giving them a quicker and less painful death. He just wants them to die because he's disgusted by them. But fact of the matter is, shooting them would be much more humane than to let them suffer for who knows how long until they starve to death and die in agony and pain, slowly and painfully. Why does the Doctor think that's a better way for them to go? They try to argue it with it being a more natural death, but that's harsh. I mean, how many people do you know, if they had to die, how many people do you know who would choose to starve to death rather than being quickly and relatively painfully, because of the quickness, being shot, right? You would not want to go through the pain of starving. That's terrible. So that idea just kind of baffled me a bit, and I just don't agree with it whatsoever. I think that's a really weird thing for the Doctor to suggest and them all to go through. Anyway, they trap all the spiders, except for the really big one, or, well, supposedly all the spiders. There's bound to be a few other ones out there that didn't come, by playing really loud music, because apparently spiders hunt by vibration. So they all crawl into the safe room and they lock him in there. And that's that for them. But they still have the big spider to deal with. So they decide to herd it out. But where would it even go? What? That doesn't make sense. But they get in there anyway. And it turns out it's gotten so big that it can't breathe properly. And it is suffocating to death. Robertson charges in. The doctor says it's better to let it suffocate than to be shot. And Robertson says, kind of like what he said before, consider it a mercy killing. Which, of course, once again, that's not his mindset. But in all honesty, I agree with him. That's a mercy killing. Than to let a poor innocent creature go through the slow and painful process of suffocation. Oh my goodness. I get Robertson isn't a good guy, but it's not good when his proposed solution makes more moral and logical sense than the doctor's. Even though it's not supposed to, because it's guns. But guns are not necessarily always bad. And I think that's kind of been a problem so far in a couple of episodes, with Ryan shooting all of the sniper bots. But they're robots, they don't really have sentience, they're just programmed to kill people. So, and then later on in the scene, she just kills a whole bunch of the reg creatures, which arguably had much more sentience. So it's this weird thing going on, this hypocrisy, this inconsistency. So I wonder if that's going to go anywhere, or if it's just going to keep being this way for no particular reason. I just find it really strange. Anyway, the spider crisis is averted. Robertson just disappears. We don't really know what happens to him. I found it really weird, actually, that he didn't get his comeuppance at some point. I really did expect him to die in the episode, but he didn't. And it's time for the doctor to be off. But as Ryan and Graham, they decide that they want to come with her. And actually, this is a really interesting companion introduction, because a lot of the time the doctor invites the companions to go with them, but this is one of the few occasions where that doesn't happen. She actually seems a little bit reluctant. Now, of course, in the classic series we've had stowaways and stuff like that, but this is a different kind of way of doing it, because all of them have their own individual motivations for wanting to travel with her. And it kind of makes sense. The best one, I think, is Graham, because he's still grieving after Grace's death. And he sees traveling with the doctor as a way of dealing with his grief, because he doesn't want to just sit at home while he continues to grieve before he can overcome it. He wants to be seeing amazing things with the doctor. And both Ryan and Yaz also want to continue traveling with the doctor because they can see what amazing things that she can show them. But what's interesting in this case is that the doctor, I expected her to kind of immediately, smile and say, yes, all right, let's go. Because that's normally what the doctor would be like. And it's clear that she wanted to be with them earlier in the episode. But here she's really reluctant and almost seems like she's trying to, she wants to make sure that they're okay with this, because she knows what can happen when you travel with her. She's lost people before. People, they change. Their lives are changed forever. And so she makes sure that they know that, and all of them say that they're sure that they want to do this. And so with a smile, she decides, all right, let's go. And I love the very ending of this where they all pull down on the handle together. So, Arachnids in the UK. What did I think of it overall? Well, I actually enjoyed it more my second watch through. I did find it to be a thoroughly entertaining episode. There were some things that I did take issue with, like the caricature of Robertson being a little bit too over the top, or the resolution. But I did find the spiders to be thoroughly creepy and well done. And overall, it was a fun, enjoyable episode. The companions could be better serviced, but that's okay. I think all of them were still good, and it's great to see them finally officially becoming companions. So, yeah, overall, I liked the episode. I thought it was thoroughly enjoyable, and it's a pretty good outing in terms of giant spiders. It could have been really cheesy, but I think they were used really effectively. So, I think I'm going to give this episode a 7.5 out of 10. That currently places it as my third favorite of the series. I like it more than The Ghost Monument, but not quite as much as The Woman Who Fell to Earth or Rosa. So, yeah, that's my thoughts and opinions on Arachnids in the UK. Please put your thoughts down in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next week with a Saranga command.